So thanks again for the opportunity to speak with you all today, and thank you for our keynote. I would say just to sort of follow up on the comments sort of from Simon there, as I was sort of watching the keynote, I was seeing lots of connections between what was sort of presented, sort of for the West as a sort of region, and some of the findings that we saw, within Alberta and certainly within sort of Calgary. I actually saw so many connections, in fact, that I thought, maybe we should just skip this one and just go right to the pub. But I think we'll sort of motor through. But hopefully, as you sort of see the findings from this study, a couple of things to give you a heads up. First, let me just
deep breath.
First, give you a heads up on sort of some of the differences, I guess. The data you saw before, obviously heavily sort of quantitative in nature. I identified that quantitative researchers obviously have hair, and qualitative researchers do not. So that's the next sort of difference here. That was a joke. Sorry. And sort of basically, this study was really, we sort of interviewed a number of CEOs, senior executives for high growth firms, and sort of asked them sort of the challenges that they were sort of experiencing, some of the opportunities they saw. And it really was, the comments from our last speaker notwithstanding, it really was focused on more on the policy side of things and, potential areas for where government can be sort of engaged more or sort of differently in that sort of process. However, to the backdrop of all that is all the things that you've been hearing, since this morning and the previous discussion, in the sense that these high growth episodes, there's not a lot of high growth firms. There's lots of high growth sort of episodes. So that's sort of a key sort of backdrop for this work. And then related to that was a lot of the previous sort of policy has been focused on trying to identify firms sort of in advance before they hit that high growth. And so I think some of the message that we're going to get here today is sort of countering some of those trends, and for the reasons that you've already seen, probably in this morning, and you'll probably hear, throughout the afternoon. Okay, so with that, so up first, just sort of the research questions. So again, the first one that we dealt with, and again, apologies for my eyesight. I'm after having multiple surgeries in the past few months. So I'm gonna have to take off my glasses here. So the first one was really around the government support needs. And so do high growth firms have different needs for government support than other firms? The second question was around the support timing. So is there a particular point where the intervention is more effective? The third one was around the support gaps. And this was sort of a snapshot, sort of currently, is what we're doing now actually working, for these sort of high growth sort of ventures. And then finally, improving support. So are there ways that supports can be made more effective for these high growth firms? And I guess sort of, the rationale for that is there a rationale for treating high growth firms differently than other firms? And I think, from this group, you're probably getting a sense that, yeah, absolutely, you need to be treating them differently. There's lots of support out there for, for startups and those types of ventures. But when you look sort of under the hood of a lot of those supports, they're not really configured to support high growth firms. And in many ways, they actually preclude supporting high growth firms, because often the high growth firms, they don't actually meet inclusion criteria. And we'll sort of see how that unfolds as we sort of go through the material. All right. In terms of enabling factors, and I think you'll see lots of parallels from the previous speaker on this. So the first thing we sort of noticed with the companies that we interviewed, and this is often pointed to as the difference between a high growth firm and a scale up. But the difference we sort of found here was that just sort of intentional sort of growth culture. And what we mean by that is that when we talk to these CEOs or these senior executives, and we asked them about high growth, it was clear that this was something that they sort of talked about at their board table, in their strategy meetings, in just sort of weekly meetings. It was something that sort of came up. It was not something that just sort of happened by accident. These were teams of folks that really saw not necessarily growth as an objective, because obviously their objectives were often around delivering value to customers, increasing sales, and those types of things. But it was certainly something that they were sort of expecting and aiming for, recognizing that it was, you know, sort of a sales and marketing sort of activity that, right, they sort of achieved that. The second sort of key theme or key enabler was these pivotal events. And I kind of got hints of this in the last talk, and then I heard some similar things in the morning. And so the idea was that the firms kind of got kicked in the sense that there was something that happened in the history of the company that kind of changed the direction of the firm more towards that sort of growth orientation. So it could be things like, well, I mean, the pandemic, you know, it was certainly one, but, you know, more commonly was, you know, things like technological advancements. There was a new innovation that either the company, you know, sort of was sort of produced, or was able to use that technology to sort of fuel its sort of growth, or there was a new founder or a new investor in the company that really pushed the company in this sort of new direction, or, you know, some sort of pivotal event that occurred that changed it towards that sort of trajectory. So it's the first thing was that intentionality. The second thing was these notion of pivotal events. The third factor was this notion of talent pools. So as we'll see when we look at the, you know, some of the constraints, there's definitely sort of constraints on the talent side, but also you know, these companies were able to tap into these sort of veins of talent, you know, within the province, within the region, and in certain sectors like AI and some of these other emerging sort of markets, these are areas where you know, Calgary and the region does have some key sort of strengths, and these companies were able to sort of tap into that. Keeping in mind, though, that it wasn't all just tech-based sort of ventures that were represented in our data, and, you know, just sort of to spin off from the last speaker, when we looked at our like sort of our selection criteria, we sort of intentionally went after companies that were not only in the tech space, and the reason being is because we knew from some broader data that high growth, you know, is not necessarily sectorially sort of focused. And when you're looking at the support that's being provided to companies, you have to be careful not simply to focus on tech, because lots of growth happens, you know, sort of independent of tech. So we sort of did the same sort of, took that lens to the sort of the talent pool sort of as well. Organic capital strategies, I think this sort of really speaks into the, you know, raising money and things like that. Of the firms that we talked to in our study, you know, very few of them, well, actually none of them actually were engaged with venture capital. Certainly lots of them had sort of larger investors and pools of angels and things like that, but there wasn't a lot of VC sort of represented there. And there was lots of sort of creative, organic, you know, sort of ways of sort of raising funds. And some of it, you know, even sort of fueled by revenue and things like that. But again, there was quite a bit of diversity in how they actually raised the capital for their ventures. And then finally was just the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem was sort of seen as an advantage. Again, you know, we'll sort of get to the disadvantage in a second, but if you look at sort of the data, you know, especially here in Calgary, you know, certainly viewed as a very sort of supportive, innovative, you know, sort of culture, you know, with some of the caveats from our sort of last speaker. And we see that sort of consistently, not only in this data, but in other data as well, like from the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, mentioned at the top of the hour. All right. In terms of the constraining factors, and these will certainly sound familiar because they definitely build off our previous speaker. The first one that really came out loud and clear from the founders and the CEOs of these companies was just market scale limitations. And I think many of them, you know, came to this realization, you know, it was a hard-earned sort of lesson. And so maybe if they came to this conference, you know, could have saved themselves a lot of trouble because a lot of them did start sort of locally and sort of grew out from there. But they quickly sort of realized the limitations of their home sort of markets, and then sort of started to expand from there. And I think but even within that sort of home, you know, sort of domestic market, they sort of saw that there should have been more opportunity, you know, to get those early sales, to get some, you know, traction in the market, to get, you know, build a reputation, and those types of things. That was certainly, you know, sort of viewed as a constraining factor. You know, notwithstanding, you know, sort of the broader markets might be. I mean, maybe Canada or Alberta is probably not their, you know, the end game, but they definitely saw that there would be huge advantages to getting early traction in that home market. You know, in terms of reputation, early sales and what have you. Another sort of constraining factor, talent and workforce gaps. This is the flip side, but this really resonated, with the last speaker, because really it wasn't the technical sort of skills that they saw lacking. It was really, marketing and a senior sort of experience growing a company. And so I think, on the one hand, yes, absolutely, governments are not going to be able to sort of fuel all this. And really, this speaks to the fact that existing companies, we really need to do a better job of encouraging our existing scaling companies to sort of mentor the next generation of companies. And I think, the comment from our previous speaker around, having these unicorns, sort of spin off all these other, sort of high growth sort of ventures really does resonate with me, because like, when the CEOs that we talk to, that's what they sort of they felt was lacking. Like there was not a lot of people that they could go to sort of recruit on the sales and marketing, or talent that already had experience scaling sort of ventures sort of previously, and that was sort of seen as a huge sort of disadvantage. The third one here is access to capital, and I guess I have to be very careful how I frame this one, given our our instructions from the last talk here. But I think one of the things that came clear from the interviews that we did was that the companies were able to attract capital, and they were able to attract reasonable amounts of money that they sort of needed, but it often wasn't from sort of Canadian sort of sources or local sort of sources. And one of the challenges with that, at least as they sort of viewed it, was that it kind of put the company on a certain trajectory. And often that trajectory was away from their base, here in Calgary. And so, most of these companies, they were strongly embedded, within the local sort of ecosystem. They were able to tap into sort of the talent pool that was here. The founders were here, the families were here. Lots of things were already here. But as certain things like their customers started to come from away, their investments started to come from outside the region, there become more and more reasons for this company to sort of move away from Calgary. And so I think it wasn't necessarily not being able to get the money, is that when they got the money, it kind of put them on a trajectory which, maybe from a policy point of view, we don't necessarily want these companies on, or we have to do additional things to make sure that some of these forces, encouraging these companies to move away, which might be on the investment side, are countered with other things. Some of the enabling features we just sort of saw on the previous slide. Lack of tailored support. So this sort of speaks directly to on the policy side of things. And so a lot of the support that's out there really aimed at the small, medium-sized companies, not necessarily the high growth or the scale up types of ventures. And actually, when they would look at what's available for them, they would often find that even some of the programs that they thought they would sort of qualify for, when they looked at the sort of literally the fine print, they realized that they were excluded. So again, it's not that it was intentionally excluding these companies, which I think most policymakers would definitely not want to do. They want to sort of encourage growth, but when you look at sort of peeled away the layers and some of the sort of the red tape of those, they sort of realized that they didn't actually qualify. So again, bringing that high growth, that scale up lens, even our existing support, would probably go sort of a long way to sort of tweaking those things so that they're more broadly applicable. And things like the timing. One of the things you're probably getting the message loud and clear for high growth is just the speed at which things need to sort of happen. And obviously, some of these support programs, there's a fairly lengthy application process. There's a period where there's a review. There's a period where things get awarded, and then sort of money sort of flows, or support sort of flows. And so all of those things are really counter to what these high growth firms really needed. They needed something very quickly without a lot of those steps in between. Otherwise, from their point of view, the opportunities were sort of missed. And I think that speaks to the last one there, the regulatory complexity and uncertainty. Again, this is not regulatory around the policy. This is regulatory around policies that regulations that are guiding certain industries. And so, I mean, the one that kept coming up here in Alberta, or in Calgary, was around some of the environmental sort of regulatory sort of requirements. And so this was sort of seen, you know, on the one hand, some of the companies, it was a previous regulation change that was their pivotal event. It was what sort of spurred the opportunity on. Whereas other companies identified that like the lack of clarity around some of those things is really sort of slowing their ability to sort of attract investment. It's sort of slowing their ability to sort of make decisions and those types of things. So again, you know, from a scaling point of view, this sort of regulatory complexity probably weighs more heavily on these companies than it would on the smaller companies, which have much less at risk when it comes to, you know, subsequent changes in regulations. They really want to sort of de-risk some of those things as much as they can before they're willing to sort of, you know, travel up that hockey stick, as it were. All right. So in terms of, you know, some of the areas, and these are not sort of policy recommendations, these are more or less areas for policy sort of consideration. And as we, I won't go through all of these, but as you sort of get a sense of sort of where these attention points are, you'll think, wait a second, most of these areas already have, like there's already supports that are in those particular areas. And that is absolutely true. But what we were sort of pointing out is that often these supports have not necessarily been sort of addressed with a like sort of high growth or scale up sort of lens. So the first one on the access to capital, again, you know, and again, some of these things, as I said, are already in play. Sort of expansion of the provincial VC initiatives and AIMCO investments. So again, it was seen as an opportunity to be able to sort of direct those funds more strategically at you know, some of the scaling activities within the province. Provincial sort of scaling grants, high growth firms and emerging sectors. So again, we're already seeing some of that in quantum. We're seeing some of that in AI and some other sort of areas. Again, this notion of partnering with private investors to improve the funding ecosystem, especially as it related to closing differential treatment across sectors. So what the feedback we were getting was that, you know, if you weren't in a tech space in particular, there was really not a lot available for you. Whereas if you look at where growth was actually occurring, often growth was happening in areas that weren't necessarily sort of tech focused. So again, you know, shifting, you know, not necessarily shifting some of the money, but at least shifting some of the attention so that you're not necessarily excluding some of these sectors that are actually growing at the rates that you want to see, but are don't necessarily have the halo effect of you know, the tech side of things. And I think the final one there, which is probably you know, more on point for this group, which is really sort of looking and facilitating having the current generation of high growth firms sort of mentoring the next generation of high growth firms. And I think, you know, you know, some of the points from the previous discussion around, you know, having the you know, the companies that the larger, you know, sort of the unicorns essentially, you know, producing all these spin outs and all these other sort of growth opportunities. I think that really does resonate with the data that we have as well. Because I think that's what they were sort of calling for. They really struggled, you know, these founders, they really struggled to find mentors that had that type of experience scaling those ventures, and a bit of a track record. All right. On the talent side, again, you know, sort of industry-driven program for enhancing STEM, entrepreneurship, leadership, and this is really the marketing and sales piece. And as a faculty member, you know, in a business school here in the city, we are guilty of this. I mean, if you wanted to do a sales course, especially a high growth sales course, you would be hard pressed to find that in our curriculum. And that sort of, you know, travels right across our MBAs, our executive MBAs, our undergrad. And I think if you were to look, you know, more broadly at the you know, business schools within the city, you would see, you know, some of the same sort of challenges. This is not something that's getting the amount of attention that these scale-up firms really need. And of course, we're essentially making that problem worse because you know, we're not feeding that talent pool that we really should be supplying. And I'll just sort of jump to the end one there, which I think is again more of that, you know, in terms of facilitating that broader community. You know, creating an advisory panel of high growth firm leadership. And I think, you know, events like this this is sort of definitely the start of those types of initiatives, because really that's where that information, that insight needs to come from. It certainly can't come from academics. We can help facilitate some of that, but really, those insights really need to come from the high growth firms themselves, and feed that into the policy making, decision making, sort of going forward. Market expansion, so strengthening, I think I've got the right one. Yep, I do, cool. All right, sorry. Sorry, a couple of things here. Encouraging cross-sector innovation and diversification. So I think this really speaks to that vertical market versus the horizontal market. I mean, the companies we talk to, they kind of got that message, sort of intuitively. But as our previous speaker, said, we really need to get that message out in a lot more clearer way, and ensure that our support providers are not discouraging those types of things. Yes, it might be more difficult, it might be more risky, but the flip side is that the payoff is so much higher. Facilitating industry diversification beyond traditional energy and oil and gas supports. Again, this is a recurring sort of theme here. Improve provincial procurement for high growth offerings. And so again, it's not that, I don't think the message is that we shouldn't be selling locally entirely, but we should do it so sort of strategically. And I think there was sort of a perception that some of those strategic opportunities were sort of being missed sort of on the local side. And then I think the final one, which we're definitely seeing movement on right now, where there was deals signed between Alberta and sort of Ontario recently, and others, where we're sort of reducing the barriers on those interprovincial sort of trade. And that is definitely a trend sort of in the right direction, and certainly something that these founders of these companies actually want to see sort of happen. Because again, they've benefited from it, and they need to see more of that sort of happening. On the regulatory reform side of things, I mean, again, this is really around streamlining business regulations and reducing red tape. Huge initiative of that, like that happening here in Alberta. But I think that probably the one again, giving all the talk around tariffs and those types of things, just really interprovincial alignment regulations, especially in strategic areas. So one area, for example, that sort of was sort of highlighted here in the study around AI and quantum. I mean, those are areas, and I think one of the areas driving the Quebec City sort of growth is probably quantum and AI. And so again, a lot more sort of alignment of those types of regulations, so that when a company is trying to scale, at least within Canada, it doesn't hit these provincial barriers. Every province hasn't got to create a completely new thing. A lot of the thing that it creates in one province can be more easily translated to subsequent provinces. On the infrastructure side, here, so here again, to sort of belay some of the points previously around R&D. Here, I mean, the increased funding for R&D, but more emphasis on the D, recognizing that a lot of the sort of the traditional research is not really closely tied to sales and revenue growth, whereas the development tends to be closer to that piece, and that's really where our data sort of points is that if you're going to incentivize something, it's probably more on the development side of things, because those are close to that sales and sort of increased revenue pieces, rather than the sort of traditional research, which, like, the path to those sales is not quite as clear. Industry-led grants to strengthen university-industry collaboration. So again, we've certainly seen multiple rounds of that over the years. I'm going to probably say something a little controversial here, but right now that money goes to the researchers like myself, which is great. We're very thankful for it. But in reality, it probably should be going to the companies, and then the researchers should be fighting to work with those companies to get that money, to actually conduct the research. Because right now, if you're going to give me research funding, don't be surprised if I start doing more academic research and not necessarily, the type of research that these companies need to sort of fuel those sales and revenue types of activities. So again, I think that's sort of an area where that academic industry collaboration, that relationship sort of can be sort of modified. Support the expansion of manufacturing facilities, logistical hubs. So what we're seeing here, again, from the companies that we were sort of dealing with, there's these sort of investments that are sort of needed that, individually one company couldn't necessarily make, but collectively they probably could. And something like that would definitely need support from government. And again, industries like quantum, there's no way a quantum startup can afford the infrastructure needed to do quantum sort of work. And so that's why we've seen universities, government sort of stepping in to provide that infrastructure. And I think finally, looking to the low tech, high growth industries for new infrastructure investments. Again, this was sort of a recurring theme. Many of our companies that we sort of interview were not necessarily from the tech space, but they were growing quite a bit, kind of like that example from the previous speaker where drawing lines on parking lots and franchising it, huge sort of scale up sort of opportunity. Again, I don't think those types of businesses get any attention sort of on the policy front. And then finally, and this one is definitely self-serving, oops, not finally, is the some sort of growth episode monitoring type of system. And maybe our previous speaker can sort of answer some of this when we do the breakout sort of sessions. But there's a huge problem with getting quality data around these types of sort of firms. And so often we end up relying on things simply because the data is easier to get, like the financials and those types of things, when in reality that's not quite the data we actually need. And we also like to be able to sort of follow firms over time because of these sort of episodic sort of nature. If we're just doing these sort of snapshots, it doesn't really give us the level of richness of data that we sort of need to be able to sort of guide, that handbook or that sort of roadmap for these companies that was sort of mentioned previously. That roadmap needs that sort of depth of data, tracking these companies sort of over time, and being able to identify these firms more readily, so we can get the input from them, so that policy can be sort of better informed. Initiatives that industries are sort of performing can be better informed. All of those things can be sort of better informed, because often we're sort of really sort of shooting in the dark and sort of guessing when we really should be knowing some of these things before making these decisions to move things forward. And with that, I am going to wrap things up. So the high growth firms, key drivers of Alberta economic diversification, job creation, and innovation. I think we sort of already knew that coming into today. Sort of by focusing on these scalable policy interventions, especially ones that are tailored, to scale-ups and sort of high growth firms. And often that doesn't mean new policy or new support. It really just means taking that high growth sort of scale-up lens and sort of directing it towards our existing sort of support and just sort of tweaking them and removing maybe some of the inclusion-exclusion criteria that is probably inadvertently excluding some of these firms from support that they could benefit from that's already out there. And also just sort of recognizing this episodic support is sort of foundational. It's not so easy to find a high growth firm in the sense that the firms, they can't continuously grow indefinitely, but they can certainly go through these periods of high growth, and ensuring that those periods extend for longer and they repeat themselves. Really, that really should be more of the focus on the policy attention, rather than trying to sort of identify these winners in advance. Again, that's very challenging. We sort of know this from the sort of the VC world. So if the VCs can't pick the winners in advance, it's very unlikely that government will be able to pick them in advance. But there are sort of early indicators that we could be sort of tracking, again, to that last call for better data that would give us early indications of these companies that are on that growth sort of trajectory. And again, as when we opened up here, like those companies, they're very intentional about that growth. So it's not like if we ask them, they would know, but we just haven't been asking them. And with that, I will wrap things up and open up for questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chad, for providing a regional and local perspective on this. This is obviously a qualitative insight as well. So it helps to really provide some further support, but also further depth to Charles' work around the quantitative side of things. Questions before we take a quick break and then roll up our sleeves for a conversation around what are we going to do about this? Does anyone want any questions? Yeah, one over there. Any questions over here?
Hello, Chad. Thank you for your talk. My question is, as a founder who doesn't have the technical skills on the business side, but more of the specialty side, how would you suggest founders like myself on getting our own knowledge and skill base built up to be able to lead these companies?
That's a great question. So where would you, like, where is your company right now? Is it, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Startup.
Startup?
Pre-seed.
Okay. Pre-seed. And where do you, like from your point of view, where do you see the gaps in your current skills? Where's the biggest one?
So I'm a specialty in my subject matter expertise, but not in the business side. So that's where I'm lacking. And that's what brings me to events like this, to learn that business side. And one of your slides, you suggested of bringing in more expertise. So yeah, just that expertise.
So how do you do that with no money, right?
How do you do that with no money? And how do you do that without going back to school for 2 or 4 more years to get that expertise?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, like if I was in your position, I would put together an advisory board. And the reason why I would put together an advisory board is because you can sort of, you can do your skills matrix and sort of identify the areas that you think are lacking, or some folks can help you build that skills matrix together, and then you can sort of start to recruit folks to sort of build out the advisory board that sort of fill in some of those gaps. And the nice thing about the advisory board, one, they get to fill in those gaps that you've sort of identified are lacking, but two, the risk for the advisors is very low. It's not like a fiduciary board where they're on the hook for a whole bunch of things related to your company. They're not on the hook for anything. Like they'll essentially give you advice. It's up to you whether you take it or not, and that's kind of where it ends. If things go horribly wrong, it's not their fault. Ultimately, it's your sort of decision. But that to me would shore up some of the perceived gaps in the organization right now. And eventually, it has other advantages too, because some of those folks, you're going to build a relationship with them over time. Some of those folks on the advisory board, like they're not really going to be what you need for the next stage of the growth for the venture. So they'll sort of step aside, and you'll probably bring new people in. And eventually, some of those folks may even end up on a fiduciary board sort of later on. And the advantage of that is, as the company starts to grow, you get used to dealing with a board. And honestly, like as the company grows and you start bringing outside money, that's going to be the biggest change, for the venture, is being answerable, to a board. And folks are going to be a lot more comfortable with a founder that's already accustomed to dealing with an advisory board, because like it's not a huge jump, to be dealing with a fiduciary board afterwards. Of course, the next question you're going to ask me is, okay, where do I find those people, right? And unfortunately, I don't have that type of answer. But like events like this, if you're having conversations with folks, that's the way I would be positioning it. I would positioning, I'm looking for advisors, and putting together this board. This is sort of the expectations. We're going to meet monthly. It's going to be for an hour or two, and just sort of set it up that way. So you're de-risking it for yourself. You're de-risking it for the folks that are helping you out, and you get to sort of shore up some of those gaps with almost $0, or at least close to $0. So hopefully that helps. Thanks. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you for this. I guess I have a question around, being that this is a regional summary, do you get the impression that the government is listening and is actually willing to take the next steps that are needed? What we see is sort of regional government, provincial government, giving with one hand, supporting incubator programs, supporting events, and then kind of taking away with the other in terms of industrial regulatory environments. How do we help? How do we as founders and creators, how do we help the government to kind of get out of its own way there?
Yeah, it's a loaded question.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, from this project, like we didn't get that sense, but we're only dealing with one ministry, and we're dealing with a group of within that ministry, that kind of get that sort of like, this is the environment that they're sort of working in. You know, they sort of get the innovation space. They kind of know the issues. You know, they're willing to, you know, they commission this research. They kind of get it. But they're going to face some of the same challenges you just identified, right? So like they can go ahead and propose certain things based upon, you know, sort of the evidence that's given to them. But then other parts of the same government, you know, are probably getting different advice, or, you know, conflicting advice, or, you know, so again, it's very difficult. I mean, I have no control over how that sort of happens. I would say though, you know, sort of events like this and sort of coming with these sort of like common asks, you know, that playbook idea, I kind of really like that from the previous speaker. Like if the more we can come with an ask that sort of builds on a playbook, the harder it is for folks to sort of refuse. And I think sometimes, you know, things can go off the rails because we kind of don't have that playbook. And without that playbook, it's sort of easy to sort of point us in sort of the wrong direction. But, you know, if we all have this agreed sort of playbook, we can all sort of point back and say, look, this is what we all agreed upon. Like, that's going to bring us in the wrong direction. How do we get back, you know, on the right direction? And then, you know, hopefully that over time, you know, allows us to sort of self-organize and coordinate. Because right now, I think you know, what you just described is certainly what's sort of happening. So, yeah.
Fantastic.
Anyone else has a better answer to that one?
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Chad, for that presentation. Fascinating insights.